Good morning. My name is Brandon Wilson, and I'm here as a director for the Somerville Historic Preservation Commission. We're very excited because this will be the first live event that we've done since COVID started almost 18 months ago. So this is one of a series of walking tours that we've done for many, many years in order to introduce people to different neighborhoods in Somerville, as well as to give more recognition and awareness to some of the historic assets of the city. We'll be going through a lot of streets in Winter Hill, in particular a little urban village that we call, and as well as ending up at the Winter Hill Brewery. And so we welcome your coming today. It's also being videotaped, so for those people that rather sit in the comfort of their own house, you can watch it that way. And we also have a brochure that we prepared for the event, and that will be on our website as well. The Somerville Historic Preservation Commission under Events and Education. So there's many ways that you can learn more about the historic nature of Somerville. We've hired Ed Gordon to actually speak today and to give the majority of the tour. And so he is very familiar with the city of Somerville because he's done a lot of surveying for us over the last 15 years. And as well, he's an architectural historian that knows properties and trends throughout the Boston metropolitan area. So it's be a very informative tour. We hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, you can reach out to the staff through our website, and also go to the website for, again, events and education under the Preservation Commission for other tours that we've done as well. We also have a newsletter, if anybody's interested, called Preservation Newsletter, and we have an I Spy challenge that we encourage you to be part of, just to watch it or to read about it, or, well, to submit photos. So thank you very much. Enjoy the tour.
We're going to be touring essentially the southern and eastern base of Winter Hill. This is a story primarily of modest but interesting houses that were originally owned by folks who worked for the railroad, which runs hard by the neighborhood, the Boston and Lowell Railroad, soon to be the Green Line extension, very exciting, and slate workers and folks who worked on the electric trolley later on. So we're going to be seeing some of that housing, but for now I want to talk about where we are, Magoon Square, the intersection of Broadway and Medford Street. These are the kind of primary thoroughfares. And just a few words about Broadway. Very early on, it is set out 1636. Broadway at first only goes as far as the Charlestown Neck, where Sullivan Square is today. It went up Winter Hill, and then it turned right onto Main Street and continued into Medford Square. The part that goes up and over Winter Hill, that extension came along in the 1790s when Broadway was extended all the way to what was then called Menotomy, later Arlington. Okay, Menotomy was the original name for Arlington, and so the primary purpose of Broadway early on was to haul products like farm products from eastern Middlesex County to haul building materials, and this was done by teamsters and with many houses and many workers and many carts. And I just learned, in fact, last night, going online, seeing if I missed anything about Magoon Square, and sure enough, supposedly the reason for setting Medford Street out here in 1813 was that it was found that in the winter time, the teams of horses slipped and slided on their way up Winter Hill, up and over the hill. So they put in a kind of a shortcut, if you will, that led into Boston over the Craigie Bridge. And it's my understanding that the Craigie Bridge follows the path of that roadway in front of the Museum of Science, that there was a bridge there in the early 1800s, and the first bridge was 1793, the West Boston Bridge that came over from East Cambridge into Boston. So the object was to get the products into Charlestown and Boston as expeditiously as possible. In the other months, it wasn't an issue to go up and over Winter Hill, so I thought that was interesting. Prior to about 1880, there were two primary families in this area, the Magoons and the Tufts. And the Tufts got here first. We'll see a very early Tufts house during the course of the tour. The Magoons built their house up and over Winter Hill on Broadway in 1783. And that was originally the Adams Magoon house. In other words, the Magoon that comes down from New Hampshire in 1817 marries an Adams daughter, and they proceed to live in that house with her parents. I don't know how that worked out, but they, this Adams, or rather Magoon, was among other things an assessor, a tax collector, all kinds of kind of high-profile public things, and so he was kind of on the radar screen around here. And then, of course, the Tufts family, the house that we're going to see, dates from somewhere between 1714 and 1719, and they, of course, over time, owned brickyards and taverns and were philanthropists, and yes, Tufts College is named for that family. But after 1880, things really start to take off real estate-wise, and you get a lot of subdivisions that are for smaller houses, small land companies. And so we're going to head into the first area that we're looking at, which for the purposes of a local historic district is called the Hinckley-Magoon area. Magoon, of course, the older, longtime family. Hinckley is the developer of the lots, and so we're going to head off this way. So we're in the Hinckley-Magoon local historic district, and the thing about this area is that it's very well defined. That up here you have Broadway and Medford Street defining its edges. To the east a few blocks is Lowell Street. To the south are the railroad tracks, and then behind me to the west is a field and the City of Somerville Department of Public Works. So there's a real sense of where the neighborhood begins and ends. And between 1850 and then especially during the 1880s and 90s, this area gets very densely built up, although here and there are surprising kind of patches of green space that represent people's side and backyards. One of the things that helped step up the development was the fact that the electric trolley comes in around 1890 over Broadway and actually along Medford Street as well. So that helps with triggering development. But along here, these four houses in front of me, the one on the left could be said to have the most aspirations to being stylish. This little mansard cottage of the early 1870s. All of these houses, except for the far one, date to the 70s. And the mansard cottage, it has a double-pitched roof. That's the mansard. It's part full top floor and also can serve as an attic space as well. And then the two houses in the middle here are very low-key examples of the Italianate style. And you can see that in the one directly across from me with a gable roof that has what's called return eaves, meaning that's not a full pediment. It's sort of, there's a break in the center. That's very Italianate. The projecting bay window, also Italianate. Anytime you see brackets at eaves, Italianate. And that is a style that is popular between 1850 and the early 1880s. And then we're going to walk down this way. The house on the corner here at Fisk and Hinckley, it looks like a Federal period cottage, meaning early 19th century, but the maps and atlases don't really bear that out. It's probably like late 1860s, but with a carpenter who's conservative and, giving us something that would look at home in the 1820s or something. A little bit of an element of mystery to it, but a really charming cottage here. And then down here, looking at a couple of things here, the very generous side and back yard here, which this gives the illusion of being a pocket park, but it is very much belonging to a private residence on Richardson Street. And then we have a storage facility here from the 19-teens. Couldn't find too much about that, but it's built in this, I call it rusticated concrete. It's not really. I mean, it's concrete blocks. Rustication is used for formal buildings that have like granite blocks that you can clearly see the joints around the blocks. Like, think the Boston Public Library at Copley Square. This is rustication in quotes. And, here and there in the neighborhood, there are these very utilitarian structures that help to give variety to the streetscape.
It's a very large lot by Somerville standards, especially in this area here, which we kind of call an urban village, because everything is very closely settled, as we like to say. And the houses are pretty modest on the size of the lots as well as the structures. But this lot in particular is well known in the neighborhood. It used to be full of apple orchards here and trees and such. And so there was one point in time where somebody wanted to subdivide this up, a prior owner and such, and we did not allow it. Trying to retain this kind of a lot, and so you can see what this area might have been like before. But some of the apples, I think, still grow here.
Okay, now we're standing here to look at a garage in the back here. My colleague, Arthur Krim, discovered that this little garage structure was a mail-order garage that came from a company called Whitridge Steel. It dates to 1927. And, I think that people forget that you can get more than household appliances via catalog, that you could get an entire garage and in some cases an entire prefabricated house sent to a house lot and then assembled. So that is just a little curious survivor back there. The street is very narrow. It seems more like I wouldn't call it a country lane, but a lane-like experience. It's a discrete subdivision by a developer named Jacob K. Wilbur. And he's giving us the same house repeated over and over, but there have been alterations over the years so that these houses don't all look alike now. But we're going to go look at number 10.
Welcome to Henderson Street. We affectionately refer to it as Nantucket at 99% off. However, I don't know how much Brandon or Ed have told you about our little street here. We love it. My grandfather also loved it. My great-grandfather also loved it. At one point, he owned 5 houses on this street. The family home is that house that you see down at the corner with the big yard. Hopefully it will remain a big yard.
We're working on it.
So that house was placed on that site in around 1868. It was moved from Tufts University, and it was rolled down Broadway and put on that site. During the Depression, should I say it? Yeah. During the Depression, my grandfather was buying foreclosed homes, and he bought 4 of them on this street. All of them were built in 1890.
1890.
1890 with house plans, as you can imagine. Winter Hill Land Company.
Yeah.
The Winter Hill Land Company bought this section, and they put up 12 of 13 of the homes. So if you look at the roof lines, all of these small Queen Anne style cottages were all put up by the same developer. The triple decker that you see was put in much later after a fire. There was another home behind these hedges that mimicked all of these houses. So he was smart enough to buy up at other people's downfall. And in 1941, he gave this property to my mother for a wedding gift. Yeah. So there are those of us who hang around. There are those of us who have been very fortunate to be here in Somerville, and we inherited property, and I don't intend on going anywhere. So these properties now, at one time, let me see, 1, 2, 3, we had 3 families within my immediate family that were all living here. I'm the last, not going anywhere. For younger folks who are coming into the neighborhood, this is extremely desirable, because right at the very end of this street, if you're going to walk that way,
Yep.
right at the very end of the street is the Lowell Street T-stop, Lowell Street, Magoon Square. As a result of that, the house where you see the gay pride flag hanging sold earlier this year for $1,085,000. All of these houses only have about 1,000 square feet of living space. Each plot is under 2,000, so it's 1797. Each of them were plotted out with that much land. I love my little land because it's easy to keep up. Not a whole lot of mowing, not a whole lot of anything else. Brandon convinced me years ago and Ed, that these houses were worth saving. We have 2 on the street that are a part of the historic designation. Hopefully, if you join me, we're going to try to historically designate that house at the corner. My intent is to try to stop that whole thing from being redeveloped into a brick apartment building. So I don't know, of those of you who are renting in the city or buying in the city, we love this little neighborhood. Ed and Brandon have always been fascinated with the types of people who came in here in the 1860s, 1870s, right through the early teens. This house that I own is Vitals, this Vitals home. He was the first owner. He was a tailor in Boston. He was on, Ed?
Somewhere in downtown
Somewhere
Boston.
in downtown Boston. He was a tailor to high-end businessmen. That afforded him to be able to buy one of these houses when it was brand new. The interior, most of these houses have 7 rooms, 7 small, tiny rooms. A lot of them have been altered over the years. If you look at this one that's right over your shoulder, this kind of gray one, that would have been the style that when it was built. It had the long porch, and it had 2 upstairs windows. That octagon window that you see was added later. But then turn around again, and you can see where the 2 windows up above that porch roof line would have been located. In the late 40s, early 50s, there were 5 of us growing up in this house, plus my mother and father. And my father thought it was a good idea to block up the windows so it would prevent my older siblings from crawling out on the roof. 2 years ago, one of my neighbors across the street here put both his windows back. So you can see how alteration took place, and then those of us who love historic homes, we're trying to restore them back. So what else do you want me to talk about?
I want you to make sure you have dinner ready and we have or lunch. But I also want to say that he won an award from us, a Directors or Preservation Award, because by then you were designated. So just to let you know, we have an awards program here in Somerville that's actually would have been celebrating its 25th anniversary last year if we could have. But what we have are 2 types of awards. Directors Awards are for properties that are not designated historic, but have done very nice work on the outside of the property, trying to bring it back or to maintain some of its historic features. And then we have a Preservation Award, which are for those houses that are designated. And as a result of you being designated, I think you got a preservation award 2 years ago or 3 years ago for the work that he did. And he's really been such an inspiration to other people around this area and such. Unfortunately, the prices around here reflect that, and it's pretty amazing that that's what it's sold for. On a square footage basis, I don't even want to do that calculation. But it also goes to show you how people's habits and needs and desires are changing, because it used to be people wanted big houses and such, and out in the suburbs with big plots of land and such, and here we have just the reverse of that. So it's pretty exciting for Somerville, and it's one of the reasons why many of us that have worked here, a couple of you have, I know Lorinda has been part of the city and native as well, can appreciate how far we've come, because when I first started working here in the city, old is bad. Let's get rid of it, tear it down, something new needs to come in and such. And so we've been working very hard and diligently with people like Ed, who's done so much of the surveying, and some other people, and Joe more recently, to actually change that attitude and to make it so that people appreciate what these are. Not only is it a connection to our past, but they're also vital and very livable spaces to live in. And it is a village. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good
One more
luck.
thing. Don't be afraid of owning a historic home, because the Historic Preservation Commission in this city is more than willing to work with anybody to try to find ways to keep the historic nature of the house. Don't look at my windows when you walk by here. Those are the original 1890 windows in the front. And Brandon, you're the first one to know I'll be applying to the Historic Preservation Commission to have all of my windows redone in the original 1890 style. It's going to cost me a bundle, so if anybody wants to drop a penny in the hat. But I firmly believe in historic preservation in this city, and any of you who own your own homes, do it. Work with these guys, they're terrific. Thanks for coming by.
Thank
I
you
wish
so
I had
much.
enough for lunch for everybody.
Thank you.
We are on Lowell Street, and way back in the late 1600s, a series of north-south streets were set out across what later became Somerville. They were called rangeways, and they were meant to provide a way into farms that were located in the hinterland, sort of in the center of what later became Somerville. So, yes, you had your east-west highways like Broadway and like, Washington, Somerville Avenue, Elm Street, that whole corridor. But you needed ways in to get to the farms, and Lowell Street was one of those rangeways. When you look at the Martin Draper map of 1851, which shows Somerville almost 10 years into its independence from Charlestown. Remember, Somerville breaks away from the mother town of Charlestown in 1842. So when you're looking at the Draper map, you're seeing little dots all over the place representing houses. And this house on the corner was, I think, very much there in 1851. So it's a house of the late 1840s, 1850s, something like that. And it was part of a small subdivision by surveyors who went on to bigger things. Charles Wood and Isaac Melvin, and their later claim to fame was laying out the beautiful Avon Hill neighborhood in Cambridge, just up above Porter Square in the 1860s and 70s. But this house, the first owner, his occupation is listed as cushion manufacturer. So that implies that he had some sort of a small factory or something like that. And it's a house that retains part of its original side lights on either side of the front door. They probably went all the way down in the beginning. There's this interesting sort of corner bay that I think was probably added later. But this is early for the Hinckley Magoon area, this particular house. And then if you look off in this direction, there's the bridge. that carries Lowell Street over to the Spring Hill area. And the Green Line train station is going to be to the right, to the west of the bridge over there. So you can see how that's just going to really open things up here in a big way.
So this building over here on the brick building here that he just referenced before, Joe, that they didn't want to have a brick building replace that wonderful former apple orchard. But this is an example of what the city allowed to happen before in the 1970s. How many people have actually lived here longer since, before 1980? Okay, great. So you folks might remember that we had some old school buildings. And there was a developer that decided that when they became surplus, which happened in the 70s as well, is that they wanted to purchase them. And one developer in particular bought a lot of the different sites for a song, and they replaced them with this building as a prime example. And actually, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. Pretty much they're that same kind of brick Mediterranean architecture. And so this is one of the reasons why the Historic Preservation Commission is so actively trying to promote to people like yourself why it is that we think it's important to recognize and appreciate this older architecture and such, which is really very special, unique, and needs to be preserved. But we need people like yourselves to come on these tours, spread the word. If you own something, to then think about restoring it rather than tearing it down and replacing it with something that's very incongruent with the rest of the area.
Okay, we're now on Glenwood Street, and Glenwood and Partridge Street next door, they were part of Horace Partridge's housing development from 1868. That's when the house lots were set out. And in the early 1870s, he is building a number of small mansard cottages like the nicely painted bright yellow house across the street from the early 1870s, and its stable survives and has been very wonderfully turned into maybe an in-law apartment or an office or something like that. But it gives you ideas about the potential for these outbuildings. And I should say that Horace Partridge, who is actually listed as living here in 1874, and then the Nickerson family moves in the 1880s and is here for some time. Horace Partridge started, he's really at the beginnings of what we would consider an Army-Navy store, a kind of a sporting goods store that he puts together in Boston. And he, not only is he selling, gear for going out fishing or something, but he's selling toys and sundries and all kinds of variety items. And he does that. He does well at that, as well as real estate speculation. So he's heavily into East Somerville real estate. He's into the real estate over here. And so as if you were to walk this street, you would see a number of these little mansard cottages that are well proportioned, have their side lights that are carry over from earlier. We are on Vernon Street, very close to Central. And in front of us was the site of something called Taylor's Ledge, which appears on the 1851 Draper Map. And Taylor's Ledge was a slate quarry, essentially, with the slate being, turned into shingles for roofs and that kind of thing. And then in 1881, the quarry is pretty exhausted, and we'll talk about the man who owned the quarry a little bit later. But in 1881, George Derby builds a factory on the site of the slate quarry, in other words, where this parking lot is today, a wooden 5-story factory building, which survived as late as 1968 and then lost to a fire. But he will do a lot more building beyond the wooden structure, and he will put up this great expanse of brick factory building in the late 1890s. And so he's starting out in Boston on Portland Street, which I think is down by North Station. And his thing is office furniture, and particularly roll-top desks. And they are beautiful, beautiful pieces of furniture. And by the early 20th century, his company is the largest manufacturer of office furniture in the United States, right here in Somerville. So this was a really big deal. And along the way, he takes on a business partner whose last name is Kilmer. And so it's Derby and Kilmer up until the 1930s, when I guess the Depression does the company in, and it's purchased by another furniture company. And then in the 1960s, the building is largely vacant, and in the 1970s, the Rogers Foam Company comes in. They're still in part of it today, and they're the ones that get the ball rolling with the artists. They only need a couple of floors for their foam products, and they rent the other floors out to artists. But Rogers Foam is best known for the manufacture of Nerf balls, okay? N-E-R-F, Nerf balls. And the design of the Nerf ball was dreamed up at Parker Brothers up in Salem that did all the games and so forth. And now the Hasbro company has the rights to the Nerf name. I don't know why I'm amused by that, but okay.
Also want to point out from here you can see how close it is to a lot of the changes that have been occurring. The Maxwell site over here, this is now called Maxwell Green, was a manufacturing facility that's been torn down in this whole new community over there. And then also I just want to mention that on that last one that we just, house we went to, somebody asked me a question that reminded me that we do a newsletter, and it's called a preservation newsletter, surprisingly. But you might have actually received it if you've gone on any other tours, because your name then got you onto it. And some people apparently don't open it. But I just want to let you know that in there is an I Spy challenge, I Spy Somerville. And this was my way during the COVID, when I couldn't do any live events, to have some virtual programming done. And so what it is, and people can actually submit photos, of sites that meet the challenge. So this one that's happening right now, it used to be every 2 weeks, but now it's only once a month, but is adaptive reuse structures. So I'm giving you a hint that that one we just went to would have been an example of that. But somebody just thought, oh, that's all you have are challenges in there. It isn't. It's actually got a lot of other news in there as well. They're not very long. It's lots of pictures. But I did want to mention it because I'm hoping that more people participate and submit photos of things that you see that meet the challenges. As I just said, it's an artist studios building, and this whole building is filled up with, I think, over 100. But I'd like Anne to talk a little bit about the studio, because she's been here for a number of years and can tell you who's here and what you do.
Risa actually knows more than I do. But the building used to be a roll-top desk factory. Did you have said that already?
Talked about that.
You can talk about the current artists and how many there are.
Oh, okay. No, I don't know exactly how many, but it might be like close to 200. They're in this building, and also our building is the kind of less historically beautiful one at the corner that has at least 100 artists in it. It's really packed artist building since the 70s. Very continuously. Rogers has been a great landlord to artists. It's super stable building, and because it's so affordable, it's always fully occupied. Yeah.
How many years have you been here?
I've been here 3 years. Reese has been here more like 15.
Okay.
There are some artists who've been here from the beginning.
And the artists vary, the whole wide variety of types of artists there?
No, it's generally painters because the building is not suitable for sculptors. So there's a little bit of clay work, but very little machinery.
And you also, Rogers Foam is still there, isn't it?
That's right, they've got the machinery.
Yeah, what's particularly interesting on this, for those of you that don't know, we're a lot of communities, including Somerville, is having difficulty trying to accommodate artists and their work-live space type of thing, because the value of real estate has gotten so high. So a number of landlords say, okay, I can get a lot more income if I actually rent it out or convert it to regular housing. So Rogers Foam is an example of a business that is still operating in the same building, but has opened it up to a lot of different artists and has kept the rents affordable, which is very significant for our city.
We are looking at a really high-style Italianate mansard substantial house of the late 1860s. The Italianate style you can see at the front porch, the way the posts are treated with the brackets that are kind of, the curving brackets, the keystone in the center there, and then if you look at the roof cornice, those brackets, the Italianate is sometimes called the bracketed style because you see brackets in every conceivable place on the building. And then this double-pitched mansard roof, in this case a hip on mansard with a sort of a hip roof configuration on top, and then more of the what's called the bell-cast mansard profile, that if you look at it from the side it almost looks like a bell. And what I love about this property is that the landscaping has a Victorian kind of flavor to it, with the way the granite kind of encircles some of the shrubbery and so on. This was the home of Warren Pollard, who owned Taylor's Slate Ledge down Vernon Street. And I think this home speaks to the prosperity of that quarry business. Pollard's family went back decades in this part of Somerville. I don't know how he is related to Darius Pollard, but Darius Pollard had an apothecary shop, what we would call a drugstore now, somewhere near the intersection of Medford and Broadway, back when Magoon Square wasn't called that yet, but was simply called The Corner. And then later it was called Pollard Square after the Pollard family, and then finally Magoon Square. But, this is interesting to have his home so close to his industry on Vernon Street. And then across the street is another, not as grand, but a brick mansard cottage of around 1870. This was built for the Vreeland family, and they were brokers. Now, whether that means real estate brokers or stock brokers, I don't know, but they are giving us a house that I think wants to be bigger and grander than it is, but nice details like the granite block basement, and I thought there was a belt course that kind of wrapped around below the first floor windows, but maybe not. But something that's a little bit fancier than what would normally be out this way. Brandon, did you want to?
Yeah, I also just want to, there's an interesting comparison between the two properties. The house at 120 Central Street behind us was restored totally about 5 years ago, and they actually got an award from us for obvious reasons, I think, and it was painstakingly done. This is a local developer who takes on one property a year in Somerville always. He lives here with his wife and family, and actually renovates and often just totally restores them, and you can see the exquisite work that they did here. All the way down to the dentals were all hand recreated You can't see them here, all around the property and such. So if you look at that property, and I don't have a before, and you look at the one across the street, the potential is there.
Right. We are looking at 58 Sycamore Street. In other words, as we've been walking Vernon Street, crossed Central, we then went on to Pembroke, and now we're on Sycamore. And what we're looking at here is an 1835, now a lovely vine-covered cottage that was built for one of the many Russell families. What was that?
That's
It's
his
the bell
bell.
that I was trying to naively ring.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So we think that this dates to about 1835, and that is also the year that the railroad right next to this house is pushed through, and it's pushed through the land of Oliver Tufts, whose house we will see in just a couple of minutes, that very old 1710s house. Well, this house represents the beginnings of Oliver Tuft subdividing his property, which stretched up and over Winter Hill to Broadway, very huge tract, and he's just kind of hiving off a small lot next to the railroad tracks for whatever reason. And the Sycamore Street Railroad Bridge, not the current bridge, but the first bridge was the first one over the Boston and Lowell tracks in what would become Somerville.
I have the pleasure now to actually physically introduce Jerry Pierce, who is the owner of this property, who has many claims to fame, one of which is owning this house, and he's going to talk to you all about it. But I also, for those of you that live in the city for a while, I'm going to test your history. Does anybody remember the Peasant Stock Restaurant?
Yes.
Cool. This was the owner and the founder.
Really?
So another one of his claims to
You
fame.
already will set your age if you tell me that.
Yes, I love that place. Yeah.
And he's cooked up a storm for us in the house, just like the last one we went. Joe Lynch was cooking for 8, and you're probably cooking for 20.
Well, yeah.
So anyway, he's going to talk to you about his house.
I bought this house in 1973. I would be embarrassed to tell you how much I paid, given Somerville real estate these days.
Shouldn't be embarrassed. That means.
And over the years, somehow when I was younger and had full-time jobs, I had more time. But at one point, I did a fair clip of research on the house. The house was born by a guy named John Russell, who came down from New London, New Hampshire, in between 1835 and 1850. The architectural historians, well, already if anybody ever thinks about planting, yes, having a golden moment here, whatever the vine is, don't. Wisteria. It is the most invasive vine in the world. This has been pruned 2 times this summer, and it is determined. It doesn't go under the clapboards, but it is incredibly invasive. In any event,
It's hiding your Christmas lights.
and it's hiding. It would like to hide the whole house if it had the opportunity. In any event, John Russell came down in somewhere in that period and bought this chunk of property which runs from the railroad to my next door neighbor. Okay, the deed that I have, which I have copies of from the registry, is a beautiful, beautiful deed with Oliver Tuft's name on it, and it's done in beautiful copper plate. It is quite exquisite to see. John Russell had 2 sons, John and William. William, the younger son, went insane or had horrendous mental problems and was committed to Danvers Insane Asylum in the 1850s when the Danvers Insane Asylum opened, okay? John and I tracked it for a while, and then there's a hiatus that I've never got around to checking out. This is the house was in, when I bought it, it was covered in asphalt shingles, which are very ugly, but have the virtue, unlike vinyl, of leaving of preserving it from moisture sealed things. And most of these clapboards are original clapboards, okay? And we spent a lot of time. When I was younger, I did most of this work myself with good friends. And the house is as it looks from what we can gather. Shortly down at Milk Row, I'm going to bring the 1852 map of Somerville, the Draper Map, and you can see that all of this area were potato fields that were owned by, there you are.
It's on the front of all of your brochures. That is the 1852
Yeah.
Draper's map.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful map. It's a great map. So in any event, so John came down, and the deed to the house reads off the land of Oliver Tufts and the Boston and Lowell railroads. So interestingly enough, the deed is the exact deed of 150 years ago. There have been few. There was a generation or two of Russells. And then there's a hiatus I don't know much about. And then a Russell bought it back. There was a family here, and then they grew old, and their son decided to sell it. So in 1973 is when I bought the house. The house was in wonderful shape. It was when I bought it. It is substantially the same. I have done very little interior work on it. I've added a porch and such in the back, but all of the floors are beautiful 12-inch wide southern pine, so you have to be careful with them. They're prone to getting indented and such like that. All of the plaster inside is horsehair plaster, which, if any of you have any nerdy knowledge, is a real problem for Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi doesn't like going through horsehair plaster. When I bought the house, of course, all the exterior walls, there was no insulation. There was back plaster, which really doesn't do very much. So all of the exterior walls, while I was running the restaurant, I would cook for about 8 hours and come back and sheetrock. And there is 6 inches of bat insulation in it. The house has no basement. It has one of the back parlors, the back parlor, has an earth floor thing. And my own theory is that this, whatever previous edifice was on the house, was maybe a root cellar with a shed on top, because the foundations for it are huge granite boulders, okay? But there is no basement. You know, that's where the furnace is right now. So I've been here a long time. The house is substantially as I bought it, and as you can kind of see on the Draper map where there are little square dots of what the houses were like. But you can see this is pretty much the formation of it. What else?
Can you talk a little bit about the railroad? Because
Surely.
Not only the railroad, but the tea are interesting.
Oh, of course. Surely. Well, as I said, the deed to the house reads off Oliver Tufts and the Boston and Lowell Railroad. And I've been here during the whole Green Line expansion, and it is, I think, phenomenal to realize that these guys back in the 1830s are deepening this. Now, this was already a valley. It was, if any of you have done any research, this was an area called Polly's Swamp, which had apparently a brook running through it, and in its day was a famous place for its wildflowers, and people would come for their picnics here. But in any event, when I moved into the house, there were still 4 tracks here. 2 for the commuter line, which is the ancient Budliners going out to Concord, not to Concord, to Lowell, the Boston and Lowell Railroad, and then, well, lo and behold, after 20 years of lagging around, the state got around. So this has been going on now for about 2 years, and what they had to do, if you have a chance to take a look over there, this bridge, the entrance to Oliver Tufts' house was from Broadway. There was no bridge here early on.
Right.
And then when the Boston and Lowell came in, they did a bridge. He owned the property on the other side. But that becomes the bridge. There are giant boulders, not boulders, great granite blocks supporting it. And when the guys were doing the bridge in 2006, I let them park. I let them park all of their big machinery in my driveway, thus saving them $4,000 or $5,000 a day and moving it.
There you go.
And when they left, they said, "Now, Pierce, we want to do something for you." So I said, "Well, what you can do is you can expand my driveway, and you can hard top it, and you can give me a nice fence." And he said, "Done." He said, that's a good price. The Historical Commission was concerned at the time because this is not wood, and they would have liked that. But I thought, by the time it needs work, I'm going to be too old and I'm not going to do it. So we'll go with vinyl here and make it look halfway authentic. When John Russell, who came, he died fairly shortly after, and this is long before Social Security, so his wife was, in effect, penniless. And so what she did, and you can see it in the deeds, she would take a note for a loan for $500 from John Willoughby of Willoughby Street, and it would be set up for a year. She would pay it back, and then she would get another $500 loan. It is so interesting to be able to connect street names with people who were around at a certain time. I always think it's very ironic that since the Tufts are pretty well, I don't think there are any Tufts in Somerville at the moment. There is a Tufts Street, down at the beginning of the expressway, which is, kind of a not very interesting street. And I think it is ironic that a family that didn't make Somerville, but played an enormous role in Somerville, both in real estate and orchards and brick making, all these kind of things, that there isn't one grand street that's called Tufts Street. Yeah. But the house is a wonderful house, and it's kind of, it's hard to imagine, but I suppose a long time ago, there would have been a country lane and you could walk by, and a lot of people like you walk by and take pictures of the house. But it has been my pleasure, it really has been, to come upon, kind of by luck, to this wonderful place, and to take the time, and mostly by my own efforts, because I don't have a lot of money, to do what I can, and to kind of, not to restore it to its former glory. I don't think there was any great, but just to restore it, to preserve it, to allow people to see and feel a little bit what this time of Somerville in its really agrarian stage. The railroad changes everything in Somerville in the 1830s. It changes the whole economy.
Onward to the Oliver Tufts house. Okay, so we are looking at what arguably is the most historic house in Somerville. Yes, there's the age factor. It is the oldest house that we still have in the city, built somewhere between 1714 and 1719 for a farmer whose last name was Mattison. But it was in 1775 and 76 that you had General Charles Lee and some upper echelon patriotic officers under Washington's direction living in the house. And so this is during the time when the British were occupying Boston, and Prospect Hill figures so importantly in that story as a kind of lookout post to see what the British were up to across the water in Boston. And also there was a military encampment on Prospect Hill. But here, you had a general living here with Washington living in great splendor at the what we call the Longfellow House today, the Vassal Longfellow House on Brattle Street in Cambridge. Washington was over there. But when you, and then after the Revolution, the John Tufts family moves in. And as late as the 1790s, there's a written description of the house which talks about that it had this, 2 stories, but with a 1 story in the back and this greatly sloping roof over the 1 story. And that speaks to the fact that it apparently started out as what we would call a salt box. A salt box was, the vernacular architecture of the early to mid 18th century. And then somewhere in the early 18th century, it's not entirely clear, but the house gains a gambrel, a double-pitched profile, and I think that was because John Tufts was the father of 13 children. So, you've got to house them somehow, but a gambrel for the early 19th century would have been very old-fashioned for the time, but for whatever reason, it's a gambrel profile rather than the original salt box. And then it's Oliver Tufts who lives here from his birth in the late 1780s until as late as 1883. He lives to be almost 100 years old, and he talks to Warren Pollard, whose house we just saw over at Vernon and Central, and tells him stories, Pollard, about what it was like to live here way back. And so some of what we know about this area comes from Oliver Tufts' chats with Warren Pollard. But originally this house stood over here at the intersection of Pembroke and Sycamore. Wasn't moved too far, but it was, this is not the original location, but not far away from it. I think it's interesting to note that in 1898, this housed the Somerville Historical Society, which, if you know it today, it's up at Central and
Westwood Road.
Westwood Road, right.
It's the Somerville Museum that I was telling you all about, but you're all going to join.
Right. So I don't know how long the Historical Society occupied this building, but that would be something interesting to find out. And in recent years, like the 90s and later, there have been some changes, and I think a skylight put on the roof in the back. But, here it is, going back to the Revolution and pre-revolutionary times.
And hopefully you told him that George Washington did actually sleep
No,
there.
I didn't, we don't know that for sure. But, there a lot of places claim that George Washington slept in their home, so he may have. But he could go home to Brattle Street in Cambridge, so maybe he didn't.
Well, some of us are going to argue that he did sleep here. But also, if it comes to the first flag raising on January 1st at Prospect Hill, he was the commander of the troops there. And that we do have proof of recently. So I'm going to assume he came here and slept the night before.
Across the street is originally built as St. Anne's Roman Catholic Church. I think there are 2 other parishes that worship in there today. But this was built in the late 1890s by an architectural firm called Keeley and Houghton. And they take over from Patrick C. Keeley, who is the #1 architect for building Catholic churches in the Boston area for the period of 1860 until his death in 1896. And then one of his sons and a partner named Houghton take over the firm. And so this is also the firm that brings you St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Charlestown on Warren Street. And it's in this Romanesque style that you usually see totally in stone, but here in brick, in part because Somerville was so known for its brick production. I don't know the story on the stained glass, but it may well have some Tiffany in it. And the tower is a major landmark that you can see from Gilman Square, which is down off to the right. And there will be a Green Line extension station in Gilman as well. And in the beginning it was an Irish and Italian parish, and then later on French Canadians and other folks come in, and the church starts out in a little wooden chapel scale church that's now a parish house but greatly altered. Original church, 1881, and this, you could call this a spin-off from St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Union Square. Part of the congregation came over here to worship at St. Anne's.
Yeah, we are going to be able to go inside, but as Ed mentioned, there's actually the what they call the English Mass. I understand that happened this morning from 10 to 11:15, and then there's a Haitian Baptist church that actually uses this as well. And they were probably until 1:30 having their ceremony, but we've been invited to actually walk inside and sort of see it. For those of you who've never been inside, it's a gorgeous church, but you can't talk, nor can we. But I do think it's worthwhile going in. I'd also like to comment on this as a Roman Catholic church, of which we have a number in the city, many of whom, like across the country, have lost congregants, and so therefore have had to figure out creative ways to stay alive and keep up their buildings. And they, for the most part, have really lovely both designed and maintained buildings, but it's been very hard. So in this case, they share, as like a lot of the others. In addition, though, the father of this, which is Father McHugh, actually is the father of several of the Roman Catholic churches in Somerville, also the one at St. Anne's as well, St. Catherine's as well, and that's how they've sort of combined forces. And he's been very supportive of historic preservation, which is not what I can say for some of the other archdioceses in other parts of the metropolitan Boston. And so this is a designated property. You might notice on the far left, that's the sign that is a designated property if somebody has purchased a plaque, which they have. You might have noticed it also on Jerry's house we just went to. That's our way of trying to let people know when it actually has some real significance. And they also did a lot of restoration on here about 5 years ago, using a local architect firm that's right actually out on Broadway, that just retired recently, but they've done a lot of work for Tufts and other places as well, in McKinley and Kelso. And they did the renovation that on the parish building as well in the back. So they own a fair amount of property on this street that goes up on the side of Sycamore Street as well as Thurston. So it's a very wonderfully maintained property, and so I think it's worth going inside to see it. And we're so pleased that that he is the father of these, because he has been supportive.
Dartmouth Street. So Dartmouth, Thurston, and parts of School Street are, it's a great subdivision in which to see Queen Anne style houses. And the Queen Anne style, it starts out in Britain in the 1860s. And initially it's about brick masonry buildings and recalling the architecture of the 1690s and early 1700s and Britain. And so originally it was more that name was given to brick buildings. But by the late 1870s and into the 80s, American architects were constructing a lot of asymmetrical houses in American suburbs that were called Queen Anne for their picturesque qualities. Roof lines that have all kinds of gables and towers and turrets, and you see a love of stained glass and beautifully carved doors, and inside there's parquet floors, and it's all about reviving quality craftsmanship as Western culture gets increasingly industrialized and mass-produced. So Dartmouth Street has some fine examples, some by big-name architects like Loring and Phipps, Aaron Gould. Aaron Gould does some of those big apartment hotels down in Union Square. And so here you've got 21 Dartmouth Street that was built in 1890, and that has, I think, every original element it ever had, and beautifully painted, and with terracotta detail, little plaques on the chimney. You've got this wonderful oriel window that's projecting out from the attic. Remember, it's a bay when it projects out, starting at the ground floor and working its way up. It's an oriel when there's a projection from an upper floor. And I should just back up a bit and say that Dartmouth and Thurston were, there was this movement to try to get it built up as early as 1853 when a plan was drawn up. But it wasn't until later in the 19th century that this actually happened. And the people who made this happen were the partners Stickney and Poor, who had a spice and especially mustard and pickle business that was based in Sullivan Square. And to this day, in Sullivan Square, there's a Spice Street, and that's a reference to the Stickney and Poor factory that used to be there. So, Stickney and Poor had this interesting habit of buying up a lot of real estate in places like East Somerville and over this way and probably other parts of the city. But one thing got in the way of developing this area, and that was there was yet another slate ledge that covered where the intersection of Evergreen and Dartmouth Street is up there. And luckily, by that time, dynamite had been invented so that you could blast out the troublesome ledge and put the streets all the way through and things like that. And this ledge was called Adams Ledge, and that was in part because the Adams Magoon family originally owned this tract way back. So I wanted you to see what could stand, a house that kind of stands for all the houses on this street, because it is so intact, it's so well cared for. Well, it looks that way. Congratulations.
So I've gotten them, come over here. Frank and Ann are the owners of this house for many years. How many years did you say? 20. 20 years. Come over here, don't be shy.
My apologies about the hedges. I usually popping up.
This is a designated house for obvious reasons, and Frank and Ann have actually done a lot of work on this house and have been a staple in this neighborhood. So anything you want to say about the neighborhood, the house, the changes you've seen?
Well, when we first bought it, it was this sort of, dreary green, and all the houses on the street were sort of matching dreary green. So it's kind of interesting to see how everybody sort of started taking some exuberance and highlighting the architectural features a little bit more. I know we went a little daring with the dark colors, but it felt like it was sort of appropriate to the period and the feeling of the house. So, the neighborhood has changed, a huge amount since we
in 20 years, it's, when we first moved in, a lot of our friends were in the design world or art world
As they are.
and they said, we were living in Brookline, and said, you've got to move to Somerville. It's a great place. You can get wonderful house for not much money. And so
Remember
we made
those days?
Yeah.
We
That's a long
remember
time
those
ago.
days, right? We made the move, and actually at first we looked around and we looked at a lot of chain link and we said, oh my God, what did we do? But over the 20 years, I mean, we love the place. And the mayor, Joe, I mean, he's been great. And the whole Somerville is like, let's face it, over the last 20 years is like, it's a whole different place.
I guess the only thing we would wish is that, we could somehow get the house next to us to do the same thing.
Well, one of the reasons we do this tour is to inspire people that are here or watching this on TV or any other number of places so you can see what you can do, the potential of a lot of these houses. That unfortunately, there was a period of time when vinyl siding or aluminum siding before that was considered an improvement. Of course, it made it maintenance free, which, that's very dubious and not so true, but that's what they thought they were doing to make it so they wouldn't have to paint anymore and they could maintain their properties. I think a lot of people now have come to the conclusion that, especially firefighters, that vinyl siding is not a good thing to do, and it takes away a lot of the architectural detail on houses because
And it
contractors...
traps moisture between the vinyl and the original wood.
Right, as Ed said, it does attract moisture. The firefighters don't like it because when it burns, the smell is really toxic. It melts, it can be damaged.
And the flash point can be higher, it's faster too.
Exactly.
Right?
We actually, there's a funny kind of story to me is that there's a house actually on a nearby street where the windows, they put new windows in, and the glare from the windows has actually melted on the siding of the house next door, which is like 8 feet away, because it's been so intense. And so he's had the owner that owns his house re-side his side of the house a couple of times because it keeps happening. So it's not all it's cracked up to be, but most significantly from an architectural historian's point of view is it covers up a lot of the original detail because the contractors kind of get lazy and they say, oh, this isn't important. They take down the dentals and a lot of those brackets and things of that nature. So hopefully, this will catch on. And Somerville's come a long, long way, as you've just said, and many of us know that have lived here for a number of years. So I'm hopeful. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your
for all the work you've done maintaining it.
This is a great, stable to the max. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's a really fabulous thing to have survived because people get rid of a structure like this and they just have a driveway all the way back. It's great to still have it. We are in front of 237 School Street, and this is a house that was built just after the Civil War, about 1867, and it is architecturally a good example of a center gable mid-19th century Somerville house. For some reason, Somerville carpenters loved the center gable, and just about every neighborhood in the city has more than a few examples of this center gable approach to design with, in this case, an oculus or circular window, and then a porch that was added later, probably in the 1880s, more of a Queen Anne porch with turned posts. But I just wanted to mention that the original owners, Elisha and Jane Hopkins, Elisha Hopkins, his in the directories, his business is listed as shipmaster, mariner, and master mariner. So he might have been a retired sea captain living over here. And he purchases the lot from two coal dealers. And I think it's interesting because it's the people that are working out in the field that are aware of what's going on in real estate, what is still open fields, what might be nicely carved up into subdivisions. And so, yeah, it makes sense that coal dealers or plumbers or folks that are out here making their work rounds would fall into areas that they would ultimately develop. And so later owner included Charles W. Thompson, Boston music publisher, 1905 to the 1930s, and John B. Rice, who was an electrical welder post-1940. So, and this is beautifully painted, and I think this, Brandon, was this an award-winning
property?
Of course. This is a designated house. There is a plaque there someplace. The two women that own this have owned it for a number of years, and it took them a while to amass the fortune that it took, as they say, to restore it, but they did. And they did a wonderful job, and we're very pleased. And you can see the house next door. People have been asking me about it. It needs some TLC and then some. But it also has that same kind of potential. Unfortunately, the owner hasn't chosen to do that, and we're hoping somebody will purchase it and actually restore it as well. But, you know, that's what happens right next door to each other.
So this is our last stop before the brewery. Last stop before the brewery. That sounds good, right? So I want to thank you all very much for coming out today for this walk. Thank you.